So taxes, a word that invokes groans and complaints from people around the world. But taxes, unfortunately, are as old as civilization itself. From funding wars to building empires, taxes have always been a cornerstone of human society. Today we'll uncover the surprising story of the first taxes ever implemented, how they evolved across the world, and why, unfortunately, they're as important today as they were 3,000 years ago. This story is not just about numbers. It's about power, survival, and the evolution of societies. Our story begins 3000 BC in Mesopotamia, which is often called the cradle of human civilization. Mesopotamia was home to the Sumerians, who built the first known cities and organized societies. But running a city requires resources, food for workers, materials for infrastructure, and a way to protect against invaders. Enter taxes. The Sumerians didn't have money as we know it though. Instead, their taxes were paid in kind. Farmers would actually hand over portions of their crops, while artisans would contribute goods or labor. These taxes were collected by temple officials and used to maintain irrigation systems, build more temples, and sustain the ruling class. But here's the twist. There wasn't a centralized tax system as we have today. Instead, taxes were tied to religion. The temples served as both economic and spiritual centers. So giving to the temple wasn't just an obligation. It was seen more of as a divine duty. But what actually happened when people didn't pay? The Sumerians actually devised strict systems of enforcement. Missed your tax payment, you might actually face losing your land or being imprisoned. And so the link between taxes and state power was born. Fast forward to ancient Egypt, around 2500 BC. The pharaohs ruled as living gods, and taxes were crucial to their divine mission. Egyptians, similar to the Sumerians, paid goods through the ways of livestock, grain, and labor, which actually funded massive projects like the pyramids. Unless you think they were built by aliens. But how do you track who owes what in a society without computers or calculators? The Egyptians actually relied on scribes, the elite record keepers of that time. These scribes meticulously tracked harvests, calculated quotas, and ensured complete compliance. One famous artifact, the Rosetta Stone, even includes records of tax exemption from 2000 BC. And here's a fun fact. During the Nile's annual flooding, when farming paused, peasants were often drafted for massive construction projects as a form of labor tax. So the next time you admire the pyramids, whether it be on Google, Instagram, or there in person, remember, they're monuments of taxation as much as they are about engineering. By 500 BC, the Persian Empire was one of the largest and most powerful in the world, stretching all the way from India to Greece. To manage this vast empire, the Persians implemented what many call the first standardized tax system under King Darius I, who also liked this video. Each region or satrapy was assessed based on its wealth and resources. The richer the region, the higher the tax burden. And this system was revolutionary as it allowed the empire to build a professional standing army, as well as build roads and even establish a postal system over 500 BC, all of which would have strengthened Persia's control even more. But of course, standardization wasn't perfect. Some regions resisted, and uprisings were not uncommon. Tax collectors were known as the eyes and ears of the king, and they had to ensure compliance, unfortunately often using force. The good old Romans. They took taxation to a completely new level. By the time of Emperor Augustus in 27 BC, Rome had a vast empire to cover, and taxes were the lifeblood of the economy. So Roman taxes were diverse. There were taxes on land, goods, slaves, and even urine. And yes, a urine tax was implemented because urine was actually considered fantastic for tanning and for cleaning. But because of the vast tax system, the Roman system had its own flaws. Tax collectors, or publicani, were private contractors who often heavily exploited taxpayers. They had one goal: to collect as much as possible so that they could keep a share for themselves. This actually led to widespread corruption and resentment, fueling huge uprisings like the Jewish revolt in 66 AD. And yet, Roman taxation funded some of history's greatest achievements, such as aqueducts, roads, and even the Colosseum. As we move through into the medieval period, taxes became increasingly tied to the feudal system. This is crazy. Lords would actually tax peasants to maintain their estates, while kings would implement tax to fund wars. One of the most famous tax rebellions occurred in 1215, when English barons forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, which would limit royal taxation powers. This document would go on to inspire democratic principles worldwide. But of course, medieval taxes were far from fair. During the Black Death of the 14th century, many governments would impose harsh taxes on already struggling populations. And the result, well, I mean, you can imagine. Rebellions like the Peasants' Revolt in England, where angry mobs demanded an end to unfair taxation.